This contest report of the 1983 Mr. Olympia contest comes from the March 1984 issue of Flex magazine. It is written by Bill Dobbins. It says Samir Bannout gets it all together and brings home the big O. September 24th, 1983, the Olympia Hall, Munich, Germany. As the prejudging got underway, all eyes were on Lee Haney. Could this gentle giant succeed in winning the Mr. Olympia title on his first try? Looking at him standing there in round one, in this case the compulsory posing round, he was very impressive, big and in good shape. But this was the Lee Haney who had almost been beaten by Greg DeFaro at the Night of the Champions, so it was obvious he would have his work cut out for himself. The man he and everyone else wishing to take home the Mr. Olympia title would have to beat was Samir Bannout. The competitors who had beaten Bannout the previous year were not on stage in Munich, which left him as the strongest threat to other would-be Mr. Olympias. And Samir looked good, maybe not quite in the shape he had displayed last year, but big, fairly hard, and still possessing one of the most aesthetic natural shapes of all time. Mohamed Makawe, winner of the two Grand Prix events and the World Professional Championships all in a row, also had to be considered as one of the frontrunners. He stood next to Frank Zane in the lineup and had told Oscar State that he was glad he would be where the judges would constantly compare him with Zane. But Makawe is one of those bodybuilders who, because of his small stature, needs to be perfect in order not to be made to look small. But just as last year, it seemed he was not at his absolute best for the Mr. Olympia, at least not during prejudging. Although, again, as last year, he would harden up and improve every day during the Grand Prix tour. Frank Zane had won 3 Mr. Olympias and in his best shape would be the most likely candidate to win another. However, in Munich, Frank was simply nowhere near his best. 3 weeks before, guest posing at Russ Warner's show in San Jose along with Samir and Lee Haney, he had clearly looked the best of the three. But something had happened during the intervening time, and Frank unfortunately looked tired, a little soft, and lacking in the legs. But this assessment of Zane is, of course, relative. Even at something like 90% of his top condition, Frank Zane remained a competitor to be reckoned with, as the 11 bodybuilders he was to defeat in this year's Mr. Olympia can attest to. Bertil Fox was down much closer to his ideal contest weight, much more shapely than last year, but still huge. He was not, however, ripped, although you could tell that he had apparently made more of an effort to get in shape than he had in London a year before. Josip Wilkoch was in good shape, although he still perhaps seemed to lack a little in the legs. But the accusation that when he poses, nothing happens was not true this year. He exhibited good muscularity during the compulsory poses. Samir easily took round one, his score of 7 well ahead of Makawe's 12, and the 18 scored by Lee Haney and Frank Zane. Samir earned 4 first-place placings in round one, with Haney getting 1 and Zane 2. Round 2, the general assessment round, seemed rather redundant after seeing everyone pose in round 1. Samir took 3 first place, Makawe 2, and Zane and Haney each 1. But the overall order of finish in round 2 was exactly as it had been in round 1, with Samir taking a commanding lead over Makawe. As the evening show, one surprise was Hubert Metz. He has odd proportions for a world-class bodybuilder, but several of the shots he hit, particularly the side triceps, made him look excellent. Jacques Neuville of France, who had looked somewhat outclassed during prejudging, also posed to excellent advantage, showing the audience how it was that he came to win the World Championships and qualify for this event in the first place. Mohamed Makawe looked much sharper in the evening than he had during the first 2 rounds. Had he looked like this all day, he would have stood a much better chance against Samir. His now familiar posing routine was, as usual, excellently performed. But aside from technical excellence, it was striking how well he related to the audience, smiling out to them as if it was the most pleasurable thing he could think of doing for them. Zane, on the other hand, if anything, looked a little flatter, and many of the audience thought his posing lacked a little bit of energy. He did not do the complicated 2-part routine he used last year in London, but instead performed the very effective routine he used to Sydney in 1980, which has been described as Frank Zane looking like a series of posters of himself. Lee Haney looked as good in the evening as he had all day. His only lack, it would seem, is in the area of experience. One of his fellow competitors remarked that when Lee was winning as an amateur, he was so far ahead of everyone else that he never had to work hard on presentation. He just had to stand there, smile, hit a few poses, and pick up his trophy. This doesn't work when you're up against the likes of Samir Bannout, Mohamed Makaway, and Frank Zane. But given that little bit of experience, just wait until this kid grows up, someone remarked backstage, and we'll all be in trouble. Josip Wilkoch looked as if he had been working on his presentation, but he was still somewhat tentative and seemed unable to relate to the audience for whom he was posing. I know I need to be more dramatic with my posing, he said later, and to bring more personality to the stage. I'm sure you'll see great improvements in those areas next year. Ed Corney's posing was, well, just like Ed Corney. Although he was way out of shape, he demonstrated that he still possesses the posing skill for which he's famous. It was odd, though, watching him pose, watching all the others pose, and realizing how much other people pose nowadays, like Ed Corney. While still competent, Corney is no longer unique. Americans James Gobert and Dale Rupplinger both seemed somewhat intimidated by being on the Mr. Olympia stage. Indeed, this was Rupplinger's first pro show and only the sixth competition of his career. They were both to show great improvement during the Grand Prix Tour, but neither was at his best in Munich. Rupplinger also had the misfortune to follow Bertil Fox in the third round. Fox's routine brought down the house. He came out charging and hit double bicep shots and several variations of the most muscular shots, and the audience went crazy. Kim, his wife, was watching out front with tears in her eyes from the tremendous reception Bertil was getting from the enthusiastic crowd. Just my luck, Rupplinger said afterwards, to follow Bertil Fox the night he really explodes. Fox's performance earned him his best score of the 3 rounds, but it was Samir Bannout who was to win the round as he had the previous 2. This year, Samir made none of the mistakes that had marred his performance in London. He was totally in command on stage, exhibiting his aesthetic shape and proportions with fluid grace. He had guest posed a few weeks before, and when brought to the microphone, declared, "Make no mistake, this is my year." And his confident manner on stage in Munich seemed to indicate he totally believed this. Afterward, the 6 finalists were brought out for the pose down: Makaway, Zane, Haney, Wilkoch, Bannout, and Fox. After a quick reprise of the prejudging compulsories, they went immediately into competitive free posing. Zane beat everyone to the punch, hitting 2 poses before everyone else could get started. Haney and Wilkoch stood side by side, and from the very back of the huge Olympia Hall, looked like giants towering over the others. Then Bertil Fox took charge, moving from one competitor to another, offering a mano-a-mano challenge. His efforts added energy to the pose down, and soon the battle made the stage backdrop, a huge stone battlements, as in a Conan movie, all the more appropriate. 4 pose down points went to Samir, 1 each to Makaway, Haney, and surprisingly, considering the best placing it had all day was a 3rd, Bertil Fox. But the pose down really changed nothing. Fox, for the first time in the entire contest, came out ahead of Zane, but Frank was too far ahead to make this any difference. The order of the finish was first Samir Bannout, 2nd Mohamed Makaway, 3rd Lee Haney, 4th Frank Zane, 5th Bertil Fox, and 6th Josip Wilkoch. The only surprise at this point was the overwhelming negative reaction from the audience to the placing of their favorite, Bertil Fox. See When the Booing Wouldn't Stop. Article, When the Booing Wouldn't Stop. The pose down was over and the head judge gave Oscar State the scores. He stood at the podium and announced the winners. In 6th place, Josip Wilkoch, Germany. Wilkoch shook his head in dismay but showed no other emotion. There was some booing in the audience over the low placing of the German favorite, but it quickly died out. Then Oscar went on. In 5th place, Bertil Fox, England. The audience went into a fury. Most of them had not, after all, seen the first 2 rounds of prejudging. All they had seen was Fox at his most impressive, charging out on stage, doing his best shots over and over, and then leaving. So they had no chance to see his weaknesses, to ascertain that he was far from ripped and well-defined. They felt that he'd been placed too low, and they made that clear, booing and whistling for more than 5 minutes. Bertil added fuel to this fire by stalking off stage instead of taking his place alongside Wilkoch on the platform, despite the urgings of IFBB President Ben Weider standing in the wings. In 1981, a similar thing happened to Tom Platz. He placed 3rd behind Franco Colombo and Chris Dickerson, and the majority of the audience thought he should have won. When his placing was announced, the audience also exploded in anger. But Tom, instead of reacting as Bertil did, hit a few poses for the audience and put up his hands to quiet them. That act of sportsmanship, Tom calculates, and the goodwill that it earned him, was worth something like $200,000 the following year. Tom came out looking like a hero. Bertil did not. You have to wonder how much of Bertel's angry response, his refusal to stay on stage and help calm things down, will cost him during the coming year. It may turn out to be one of the most expensive gestures of his entire life. And then they have another article here, Prejudging the Judges. Samir Badu sat in the bar of the Hilton Hotel in Munich 2 nights before the Mr. Olympia contest, talking to IFBB Executive Vice President Oscar State and Wayne D'Amelia. Samir was wearing his competitive face, cheeks hollow, skin drawn, eyes sunken. In short, he looked in shape and a good bet to do well. I went through hell the last 10 days, he said in a soft voice. I'm so weak from dieting I could hardly walk to the subway, but I believe I am 25% better than last year. He paused and looked at the two men, weighing the wisdom of what he wanted to say next. The only thing I worry about is the judges, he continued hesitantly. The competitors go through all this torture, but I don't think all the judges appreciate the effort. The judges certainly don't go the same thing, and I don't know if they understand what it's really like. Samir was still smarting from the fact that the previous year in London, one judge had placed him 8th in the symmetry round. In fact, Samir's feelings were so strong that he brought the matter up in the general meeting the next day and publicly asked Ludek Nosek of Czechoslovakia, the judge in question, for an explanation. I admit I placed you too low last year, Nosek told him, but it was a mistake on my part. Believe me, there was no personal hostility involved. Eventually, Samir accepted Nosek's declaration of goodwill and they shook hands. But the question of judge and judging was one that would continue to come up during the Grand Prix tour the following week. Indeed, it was finally decided in 1984 that competitors themselves would nominate judges for the professional shows, and those judges getting the greatest number of endorsements would be chosen to officiate. I'm not bringing these things up to make trouble, Samir confided later. Why should I? After all, speaking up as I did might have prejudiced some of the judges against me. But as all the top professional bodybuilders in the world, the Mr. Olympia competitors are held to very high standards of performance, and all of us agree that the judges ought to be held at a much higher standards, just as we are. That isn't too much to ask, is it? Albert Busak is a charming, intelligent man and a good host. The weekend of the Mr. Olympia, however, he was obviously a man under a great deal of pressure. I want this Mr. Olympia to be perfect, he told me. I'm holding it at the Olympia Hall, the best auditorium in Munich. I've arranged for the most competent stage crew and backstage expediters I could find. The competitors are staying at the Hilton right beside the beautiful English Gardens. We're sold out for the evening show and have been for many months, and I expect a very good crowd for the prejudging. And indeed, he made good on all his promises. The stage, lighting, and sound at the Olympia Hall were all first rate. The contest was extremely well run and organized, and to add icing to the cake, Albert put on a banquet after the show second to none. Bodybuilding is growing in Germany, Albert told us during the post-Olympia feed, as you will see by how well the German team does at this year's World Championships. That's why I'm so sorry that Mr. Olympia went so well. We want the whole world to know how important bodybuilding is to us in Germany, and hold a successful Mr. Olympia is just one way of making that statement. And then there's an article, The Man Who Wasn't There. They bent the rules a little to allow Greg DeFaro to compete in the Mr. Olympia, but after his strong showings in the World Professional Championship and the Night of the Champions, all agreed he was a deserving Olympia-level competitor. But when prejudging started in Munich, DeFaro was conspicuously absent. I was at Heathrow Airport on Wednesday, DeFaro said, waiting to board the plane, and I passed out. By the time I got myself together, the plane had left, with my luggage on board. Greg explains that since leaving the United States, he had been sick with an inner ear, throat, and lymph gland infection. My doctor gave me a prescription, he says, and I thought I would get better. Obviously, I was wrong. DeFaro tried to get on the next and final flight to Munich on a standby basis, but he was told there was no space. He explains that he left the airport and figured that since he didn't have to compete until Saturday, he could rest on Thursday and fly to Munich on Friday. Unfortunately, he had not figured on Oktoberfest, and he was unable to book a flight until 9 o'clock in the morning on Saturday. That's impossible, was Oscar State's reaction when he was informed of these plans. Prejudging begins at 10. Greg arrived during the day on Saturday, missing the Mr. Olympia, and the next day flew to Zurich for the Swiss Grand Prix. I'm very upset at not being in the Mr. Olympia, Greg explained later, but I was so ill that there was no way I could have done my best. However, I want to tell all my fans that I would have been there if I could have gotten a flight. I certainly won't miss the next show on purpose. The end.